At 6:30 in the morning on March 23, 1943, Sergeant John Nowak crouched behind a sandbagged half-track in the Tunisian hills east of El Guettar, watching German panzer tanks roll toward his position in the grey light of dawn. Nowak was a machine gunner with the 601 Tank Destroyer Battalion. He had been in North Africa for 4 months. He had never destroyed a tank. The Germans had sent the 10th Panzer Division to crush the American advance. 57 tanks were coming straight at him. Nowak had spent the previous night digging his half-track into the rocky ground with picks and shovels. His hands were raw, his back ached, but he could see the dust clouds rising in the distance, and he knew the Germans were coming fast. The air smelled of diesel fumes and cordite. The Tunisian hills were barren, covered with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings that offered little cover. To the south lay the salt marshes of Chott El Guettar, a natural barrier that channeled any attacker directly into the American guns. To the north rose the jagged peaks of the Jebel Mountains. The Germans had no choice but to come straight down the highway. Nowak checked his ammunition belts for the 3rd time that morning. His M3 half-track carried a 75mm gun that could penetrate German tank armor, but only at close range. The half-track itself offered almost no protection. A determined man with a rifle could punch holes through its thin steel sides. Against the 88mm guns mounted on German tanks, Nowak might as well have been sitting in a cardboard box. But he was not going to run. Not this time. 1 month earlier, these same Americans had suffered the worst defeat in United States Army history. At a place called Kasserine Pass, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had torn through American lines like they were made of paper. The Germans killed 300 Americans, wounded 3,000 more, and captured another 3,000. They destroyed 183 tanks. They seized 208 artillery pieces. American soldiers had abandoned equipment, fled their positions, and retreated 50 miles in chaos and panic. The roads leading west from the pass had been clogged with fleeing vehicles. Officers lost contact with their units. Radio communications broke down. Supply trucks drove in circles looking for units that no longer existed. Ambulances could not reach the wounded because the routes were blocked by abandoned equipment. Some American soldiers had fought bravely. Individual companies and battalions had held their positions until they were overwhelmed. But the overall picture was one of confusion, poor leadership, and collapse. The Germans had captured enough American equipment to outfit an entire division. They found warehouses full of food, fuel, and ammunition that the retreating Americans had not bothered to destroy. Rommel had written in his journal that the Americans were soft, inexperienced, and poorly led. German intelligence officers mocked American tactics. Hitler himself dismissed the United States Army as incapable of fighting a modern war. One German officer reportedly said that American soldiers were better equipped for a football game than a battle. Now, exactly 30 days later, those same Americans were about to prove every single one of them wrong. What happened in the next 12 hours would transform the United States Army from an object of ridicule into a fighting force that would help destroy the Third Reich. The disaster at Kasserine Pass began on February 14, 1943, when German armor punched through American positions at a place called Fied Pass in central Tunisia. The attack caught the Americans completely unprepared. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the 2nd Corps. He was 59 years old, a career officer who had never seen combat. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, had called Fredendall one of the best officers in the entire United States Army. Marshall was wrong. Fredendall had established his headquarters in a ravine 70 miles behind the front lines. He ordered engineers to blast tunnels into solid rock to create a bomb-proof command post. The project took 3 weeks and consumed resources that could have been used to strengthen the front. His own soldiers called it Shangri-La, a million miles from nowhere. Others called it Lloyd's very last resort. While his men dug foxholes in the desert with entrenching tools, Fredendall demanded a bulletproof Cadillac like the one General Eisenhower drove. He rarely visited the front. During the entire campaign, Fredendall almost never personally observed his defensive positions or spoke with the soldiers who would have to hold them. He issued orders using bizarre slang and made up codes that confused his own officers. He called infantry walking boys and artillery popguns. Instead of using standard map coordinates, he invented phrases like, "the place that begins with C." His subordinates wasted precious time trying to figure out what he meant. In the chaos of battle, that wasted time cost lives. Worse, Fredendall scattered his forces across the Tunisian landscape in small, isolated groups that could not support each other. He divided the First Armored Division into penny packets, spreading its combat power so thin that it could not concentrate against any threat. He ignored advice from commanders who had actually seen the terrain. He placed units too far apart to provide covering fire. He positioned infantry on hilltops that could not support each other, separated by valleys that German tanks would soon fill. When subordinates questioned his dispositions, Fredendall dismissed their concerns. He told one officer that his job was to follow orders, not to think. He feuded openly with Major General Orlando Ward, commander of the First Armored Division, and excluded him from planning meetings. The relationship between Corps and Division headquarters deteriorated to the point where officers stopped sharing information. Rommel saw the weakness immediately. He had been fighting in North Africa for 2 years. He knew how to exploit poor positioning. He understood that scattered units could be defeated in detail, surrounded and destroyed one by one before reinforcements could arrive. He sent his panzers through gaps in the American lines, surrounded isolated units, and annihilated them piece by piece. The German attack was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft worked together in perfect coordination. Dive bombers hit American positions moments before the panzers arrived. Artillery suppressed defensive fire, while infantry infiltrated through gaps. The Americans, who had trained for years but never faced a real enemy, simply could not respond fast enough. At Sidi Bouzid, German tanks caught Combat Command A of the First Armored Division in a trap. The American commander had positioned his forces on 3 isolated hills that could not support each other. When the panzers attacked, each position was on its own. American M3 Lee tanks rolled forward to counterattack. The Lee was an awkward vehicle, designed in haste when America entered the war. It had a high silhouette that made it an easy target. Its main gun was mounted in a sponson on the side, not in a turret, which limited its ability to engage targets. But it was what the Americans had, and they sent it into battle. The Lee tanks drove straight into hidden German 88mm guns. The 88 was perhaps the deadliest weapon in the German arsenal. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, it had proven devastatingly effective against tanks. Its high-velocity shells could penetrate American armor at ranges where American guns could not reply. Edwin Westrate documented the slaughter in his book about forward observers. He wrote that it was murder. American tanks rolled right into the muzzles of the concealed 88s. All they could do was stand there and watch tank after tank blown to bits or burst into flames. Those in the rear tried to turn back, but the 88s seemed to be everywhere. The German gunners had prepared their positions carefully, with interlocking fields of fire. Any tank that escaped, one gun drove into the sights of another. The Americans lost over 100 tanks in a single day. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, General George Patton's son-in-law, was captured while trying to organize a counterattack. He would spend the rest of the war in a German prison camp. Panic spread through the Second Corps like wildfire. On the Tebessa Road, an entire company of engineers broke and ran without firing a shot. German infiltrators wearing stolen American uniforms captured 100 soldiers who thought they were being relieved by friendly forces. Men abandoned their positions and fled toward the rear, throwing away equipment that slowed them down. Even artillery observers left their posts, shouting that the place was too hot. The roads became clogged with retreating vehicles. Trucks crashed into each other. Tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned. Officers could not find their units. Units could not find their officers. The chain of command disintegrated. Some American soldiers did fight. On isolated hilltops, infantry companies held their positions until they ran out of ammunition. Tank crews stayed with their vehicles until the Germans overwhelmed them. Artillery batteries fired until the panzers rolled over their guns. But these acts of courage could not change the overall picture of disaster. By February 20th, Fredendall had collapsed under the pressure. Major General Ernest Harman arrived as deputy commander. When he reached headquarters, Fredendall handed him a note, authorizing him to take charge of the front. Then Fredendall went to bed. Harmon was astonished. He later told Eisenhower that Fredendall was no damn good and should be relieved immediately. But first, he had to stabilize the front. Harmon drove forward to assess the situation and found chaos everywhere. Units had no idea where the enemy was. Commanders had no idea where their own forces were. The front had simply evaporated. Harmon managed to organize a defense, helped by the fact that Rommel had already decided to withdraw. The German supply lines were stretched thin. Rommel was receiving less than half the fuel he needed to sustain offensive operations. Allied reinforcements were arriving daily. The British had dispatched tanks and artillery to shore up the American position. Rommel knew he could not sustain the offensive without risk of being trapped himself, but the damage was done. In 8 days of fighting, the Americans had suffered over 6,500 casualties. They had lost nearly 200 tanks, over 100 half-tracks, and more than 200 artillery pieces. The Germans had captured enough fuel to run their vehicles for weeks. They had seized mountains of ammunition and supplies that the retreating Americans had not bothered to destroy. Rommel wrote in his journal that the tactical conduct of the American defense had been poor, but he also noted something that other German commanders missed. He observed that the Americans had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had succeeded in grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points. Most German officers dismissed this observation. They believed the Americans would never be serious opponents. German soldiers joked that fighting Americans was easier than training exercises. British commanders were equally dismissive. Field Marshal Harold Alexander, who commanded all Allied ground forces in North Africa, told American officers that he was sure they must have better men than Fredendall. Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, commander of the British First Army, had considered Fredendall incompetent even before Kasserine. Now he felt vindicated. The American press told stories of disaster and humiliation. Families back home read about their sons running from German tanks. Editorials questioned whether the United States could ever match the military prowess of Germany. The reputation of the United States Army had never been lower. Something had to change. And it did. On March 5, 1943, General Dwight Eisenhower visited Second Corps headquarters at Tebessa. He pulled aside Brigadier General Omar Bradley, who had recently completed an inspection of the Corps. Eisenhower asked what Bradley thought of the command situation. Bradley replied that it was pretty bad. He had talked to all the division commanders. To a man, they had lost confidence in Fredendall. Eisenhower made his decision. He would replace Fredendall with Major General George Patton. Patton arrived at Second Corps headquarters on March 6 at 10 in the morning. He found Fredendall still eating breakfast. After a brief meeting, Patton formally relieved him. He told Fredendall that the Second Corps was primarily a tank show, and he knew more about tanks. Patton wrote in his diary that night that Fredendall had conducted himself well. In a letter to his wife, he even called Fredendall a great sport and suggested he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. 1 week later, Patton had completely changed his mind. After inspecting his new command, he wrote in his diary that he could not see what Fredendall had done to justify his existence. He had never seen such little order or discipline. Patton went to work immediately. On his first full day of command, he ordered the mess hall closed at 7:30 in the morning. Any officer who arrived late would go hungry. Then the inspections began. Patton demanded that every soldier wear a helmet and leggings at all times. Officers had to wear neckties, even in combat. Men had to shave every day. Patton fined soldiers who violated the dress code. He fined officers who allowed their men to violate it. The troops grumbled. They called the new rules ridiculous. They complained that Patton cared more about neckties than tactics. But something was changing. Decades later, one officer who served under Patton remembered his first encounter with the legendary general. Patton had announced that every man old enough would shave every day. Officers would wear ties in combat. Then Patton stepped forward until he was about a foot from the officer's face and declared that anyone wearing a wool knit cap without a steel helmet would be shot. The officer believed him. Patton's discipline was not about appearance for its own sake. He understood that soldiers who paid attention to small details would pay attention to large ones. Men who kept their uniforms clean would keep their weapons clean. Units that followed orders about neckties would follow orders about tactics. An army that looked sharp would feel sharp, and soldiers who felt like professionals would fight like professionals. More importantly, Patton wanted his men to feel like soldiers again. After Kasserine, American troops felt defeated before they even engaged the enemy. They expected to lose. They had absorbed the German contempt and the British condescension. They believed they were inferior. Patton intended to change that belief by changing how they saw themselves. He also made changes that had nothing to do with uniforms. He reorganized units that Fredendall had scattered, concentrating combat power instead of dispersing it. He demanded that officers lead from the front, not from bunkers 70 miles in the rear. He visited forward positions constantly, often under fire, so his men would know that their commander shared their dangers. When a shell exploded near Patton during one inspection, he did not even flinch. His soldiers noticed. When Patton gave orders, everyone knew exactly what he meant. No more cryptic codes or confusing slang. If Patton wanted the infantry to attack a hill, he said attack that hill. If he wanted the artillery to provide supporting fire, he told them precisely when and where. The fog of confusion that had paralyzed the Second Corps under Fredendall began to lift. Patton also demanded that his units train harder than they ever had. He conducted live-fire exercises with real ammunition. He made units practice night movements and coordinated attacks. He drilled his artillery crews until they could mass fire on a target within minutes of receiving the order. Some officers complained that Patton was driving the men too hard. Patton replied that sweat in training saved blood in battle. But Patton understood that discipline alone would not win battles. His men needed a victory. They needed to prove to themselves, to the British, and to the Germans that they could fight. The opportunity came on March 17th, when Second Corps launched an offensive toward the town of Gafsa in central Tunisia. The mission was to threaten the rear of German forces defending against the British Eighth Army to the south. If the Americans could break through to the coast, they would cut off tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers from their supply lines. Patton assigned the main assault to the First Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One. The division commander was Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, a 55-year-old cavalryman who had been wounded twice in the First World War. Allen was everything Fredendall was not. He led from the front, knew his men personally, and radiated confidence. His assistant division commander was Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of former President Theodore Roosevelt. At 55, Roosevelt was the oldest general officer in a combat division. He walked with a cane due to arthritis. He carried a pistol but no rifle. He wore a wool cap instead of a helmet, which would have infuriated Patton if Roosevelt had not been so effective in combat. Together, Allen and Roosevelt had forged the Big Red One into the best infantry division in North Africa. Their men adored them. Their enemies feared them. On the morning of March 17th, the First Infantry Division advanced toward Gafsa. The Italian garrison defending the town had already received orders to withdraw. They retreated without a fight. Patton had his first victory, hollow as it was. The next day, March 18th, Lieutenant Colonel William Darby led his 1st Ranger Battalion into the oasis town of El Guettar, 15 miles southeast of Gafsa. Again, the Italian defenders withdrew rather than fight. The Americans now controlled a critical road junction that led toward the coast. But Patton knew the Germans would not let them keep it. The Axis commanders recognized the threat immediately. If the Americans broke through to the coast at Gabes, they would cut the supply lines to German forces facing the British at the Mereth Line. The entire Axis position in southern Tunisia would collapse. German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had taken command of all Axis forces in Tunisia after Rommel departed on March 9th, ordered the 10th Panzer Division to counterattack. The division had 57 operational tanks, including 16 of the long-gunned Panzer IV Ausf-G, the most powerful tank in the German arsenal in North Africa. Supporting the tanks were thousands of infantry, artillery, batteries, and self-propelled guns. Von Arnim shared Rommel's contempt for American fighting ability. He believed a spoiling attack would easily push the Americans back through the mountains. The Germans had done it at Kasserine. They expected to do it again. The American commanders knew the attack was coming. They had intercepted German communications and gathered intelligence from local sources. General Allen positioned his infantry regiments in the hills east of El Guettar, blocking the roads that led from the coast. Unlike Fredendall, Allen had personally walked the ground. He knew every ridge, every valley, every approach route. He placed his units where they could support each other with interlocking fields of fire. He placed the 601 Tank Destroyer Battalion directly in the path the German tanks would have to take. It was a risky decision. The tank destroyers would face the full weight of the German assault. They would be outnumbered and outgunned. But Allen believed in them, and he believed in the defensive positions his staff had prepared. The 601 was equipped with M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks mounting 75mm guns. The vehicles offered almost no protection. A rifle bullet could penetrate their thin armor. A heavy machine gun could shred them. Against German tank guns, they were death traps. The crews knew it. Every man in the battalion understood that if the Germans got close, their vehicles would provide no safety at all. But the M3 also had advantages. It was fast, maneuverable, and carried a gun that could penetrate German tank armor at close range. Tank destroyer doctrine called for using speed and ambush tactics to destroy enemy tanks, then withdrawing before the enemy could respond. The doctrine had never been tested against German panzers in a major battle. El Guettar would be the proving ground. Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Baker commanded the 601. He was a professional soldier who had studied armored warfare and understood both its potential and its limitations. He had 31 M3s operational, plus a few M6s, carrying obsolete 37mm guns that were nearly useless against modern tanks. Against 57 German tanks and thousands of supporting infantry, the odds were nearly 2-1 against him. In armoured warfare, those were odds that usually meant annihilation. Baker positioned his half-tracks on the reverse slope of a ridge called Kedab, overlooking Highway 15, the main road from the coast. The reverse slope position meant the Germans could not see his vehicles until they crested the ridge. By then, they would be at point-blank range. The crews dug their vehicles into the rocky ground until only the guns protruded above the terrain. They piled sand around the sides for camouflage and covered the half-tracks with scrub brush. From a distance, they were nearly invisible. Forward observers registered artillery targets on likely approach routes. Engineers laid minefields across the highway and marked routes for the half-tracks to use when repositioning. Communication lines were checked and rechecked. Every man knew his job and understood the plan. Then they waited. The night of March 22nd was cold and clear. The men tried to sleep but could not. They smoked cigarettes and talked quietly. They wrote letters home that might never be sent. They checked their weapons one more time. Somewhere in the darkness, the Germans were coming. At 4:30 on the morning of March 23rd, a German motorcycle carrying 2 soldiers blundered into American lines. One rider was captured immediately. The other was wounded trying to escape. Under interrogation, the captured soldier revealed that a major German attack would begin at 6 in the morning, just 90 minutes away. The warning spread through the American lines like wildfire. Officers roused sleeping men. Crews scrambled to their vehicles. Ammunition was distributed. Weapons were loaded. In less than 2 hours, the Germans would attack with 57 tanks and thousands of infantry. The Americans used every minute to prepare their positions. Sergeant John Nowak and the other men of the 601 barely had time to take their stations before the first German tanks appeared on the horizon. In the dim light of early morning, Nowak could see a formation of panzers and self-propelled guns advancing in a square formation, with infantry carrying vehicles mixed among them. The formation stretched across the valley, a mass of steel and men that seemed to fill the entire world. The roar of tank engines filled the valley. Dust rose in thick clouds behind the advancing vehicles. The ground shook with the weight of the German armor. It was a terrifying sight, the kind of military power that had conquered most of Europe. Many of the Americans watching had never seen anything like it, but they did not run. They waited. What happened next would determine whether the American army could fight. The German tanks advanced in parade ground formation, confident and disciplined. They expected the Americans to break and run, just as they had at Kasserine. The 601 let them come. Baker had ordered his men to hold fire until the Germans reached the minefield. The half-track stayed hidden behind the ridge, their crews watching through binoculars as the panzers rolled closer. At the minefield, the German formation began to break apart. 8 tanks hit mines and stopped, their tracks blown off. The rest of the formation split into 2 groups. 30 tanks swung left toward El Guettar along Highway 15. The remainder continued toward the American positions on Kedah Bridge. Company A of the 601 engaged the tanks heading toward El Guettar. The half-tracks popped up over the ridgeline, fired at the German flank, then backed down before the panzers could return fire. Within minutes, American gunners knocked out 8 tanks. The survivors fell back, towing 4 disabled vehicles with them. The rest of the 10th Panzer Division pressed forward against Companies B and C. The German tanks advanced in lines, with infantry moving between them. It looked like a training exercise. The Americans opened fire at close range. Armor-piercing rounds streaked across the valley. Forward observers called out distances and directions. Half-tracks bounced up to the ridgeline, fired, and dropped back down. The German tanks kept coming. At some positions, the fighting became hand-to-hand. German infantry reached the American lines. Tank destroyers and panzers exchanged fire at ranges of 100 meters or less. Men died on both sides. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of engines, explosions, and gunfire that made communication almost impossible. Smoke and dust obscured the battlefield. Commanders lost track of their units. Crews fought on instinct, firing at any target that appeared. Sergeant Nowak watched German tanks advance to within spitting distance of his position. His machine gun hammered at the infantry following the panzers, trying to separate the foot soldiers from their armoured support. Shell casings piled around his feet. The barrel of his gun glowed red from continuous fire. When German soldiers got too close, he grabbed his rifle and fought them off by hand. One half-track took a direct hit from a German 88. The vehicle exploded, killing the entire crew. Another was disabled by a mine and abandoned under fire. The crews of destroyed vehicles grabbed rifles and joined the infantry in the foxholes. There was no rear area, no safe place to retreat. Every American on that ridge knew that if the Germans broke through, they would all die. Then American artillery joined the fight. The First Infantry Division had placed its field artillery battalions behind the front lines, with forward observers positioned on high ground to call in fire on the German approach routes. When the 10th Panzer Division attacked, the American guns were ready. 105mm and 155mm shells rained down on the German formation. The artillery crews used time fuses that detonated the shells above the ground, spraying shrapnel in a deadly arc. Airbursts were especially effective against infantry in the open. A single shell could kill or wound dozens of men. The Germans had no protection. The 1st Infantry Division's artillery had been positioned with care. Throughout the night before the attack, the gunners had laboured to prepare their positions. Forward observers had registered every likely approach route. Ammunition had been stockpiled at each battery. By dawn, they were ready. When the call came, they delivered a concentration of fire that stunned the German attackers. The bombardment was devastating. German soldiers fell by the dozens. Armoured vehicles ground to a halt with their crews dead or wounded inside. Officers tried to rally their men but could not make themselves heard over the explosions. The parade ground formation that had looked so impressive at dawn disintegrated into chaos as men scattered for cover that did not exist. By noon, the German assault had collapsed. The 10th Panzer Division had lost between 30 and 40 tanks. The division reported that it was in dire straits after the failure of the attacks. Hundreds of German soldiers lay dead or wounded in the valley. The survivors pulled back to reorganize. They had only 26 serviceable tanks remaining. The battle was not over. In the afternoon, the Germans intercepted American radio communications, revealing that a second attack was planned for after 4:30. This time, the Americans knew exactly when and where the blow would fall. General Allen ordered his artillery to prepare a reception. The guns were recited on new approach routes. Ammunition was brought forward. Forward observers took up positions where they could see the entire German line of advance. The 1st Infantry Division was ready. When the German infantry advanced behind their remaining tanks, American artillery observers had the range. They waited until the enemy closed to 1,500 yards, well within effective range of every gun in the division. Then the observers called in the fire mission. Every gun in the First Infantry Division opened fire simultaneously. High explosive shells and airbursts tore through the German ranks. The ground erupted in a continuous chain of explosions. Visibility dropped to near zero as smoke and dust filled the valley. The German infantry never had a chance. The 10th Panzer Division's infantry tried to press forward, but the artillery was too accurate and too intense. Officers fell. Communications broke down. Units lost cohesion. Some German soldiers threw themselves into shell craters for cover, only to be killed when the next rounds arrived. Others simply turned and ran. The 10th Panzer Division's infantry never reached the American lines. By evening, the Germans withdrew for good. The attack had cost them dearly in men, tanks, and most importantly, in confidence. The division that had helped destroy the Americans at Kasserine Pass had itself been stopped cold by those same Americans. The Battle of El Guettar was the first significant American victory against German armor in the Second World War. In one day of fighting, the Americans had destroyed more German tanks than they had lost in the entire Kasserine debacle. They had proven that American soldiers could defeat experienced German tank units in open battle. They had validated Tank Destroyer doctrine, showing that mobile anti-tank guns could stop a panzer assault if properly positioned and supported. Most importantly, El Guettar restored American confidence. The men who had fled at Kasserine had stood and fought at El Guettar. They had looked German panzers in the face and not blinked. They had taken everything the enemy could throw at them and had thrown it right back. They knew now that they could win. But the transformation of the American army did not end at El Guettar. It was just the beginning. In the days following the battle, American forces continued to advance. Lieutenant Colonel William Darby's Rangers carried out one of the most daring operations of the entire North African campaign. William Orlando Darby was 32 years old, a graduate of West Point who had volunteered to create America's first commando unit. He had trained his men in Scotland under British commando instructors, subjecting them to the most brutal physical conditioning program in the American Army. Of the 600 men who had begun Ranger training, only 500 had completed it. One man had died during training. The survivors were the toughest soldiers in the United States Army. Italian forces held a strong defensive position at the pass of Jebel el Ankh, blocking the American advance toward the coast. The terrain on either side appeared impassable. Rocky cliffs rose hundreds of feet on both flanks. The only road ran directly through Italian guns that had been registered on every approach route. A frontal assault would mean disaster. American units had been shot to pieces time after time, trying to break through similar defensive positions. But Ranger patrols had discovered a hidden path through the mountains, a 12-mile route through gorges and ravines that led to the Italian rear. The path was so difficult that Italian commanders had assumed no force could move through such terrain. They had not bothered to defend it. General Allen asked Darby if his Rangers could secretly bypass the Italian defences and launch a surprise attack from the rear. Darby studied the maps and the patrol reports. He believed it could be done, but it would require every man in his battalion to perform at peak efficiency for an entire night, moving in complete silence through terrain that could break bones and end careers. On the evening of March 20th, Darby briefed his men. They would move out at nightfall. They would carry extra ammunition and rations, but leave behind any equipment that was not essential. They would tape their dog tags so they would not rattle. They would blacken their faces with burnt cork. No one would speak above a whisper. No one would smoke. No one would make any noise that might alert the enemy. If a man fell, he would pick himself up in silence. If a man was injured, he would wait in silence until the battalion could send help. 500 Rangers and 70 mortarmen from a supporting heavy weapons company set out into the darkness. The terrain was brutal beyond anything they had experienced in training. Men climbed hand over hand up rocky slopes that were invisible in the darkness. They slipped and fell on loose scree. They passed equipment up and down cliffs that seemed vertical. Officers who lost their footing tumbled into ravines. Several men broke bones and had to be left behind with medics who volunteered to stay with them. They travelled all night, picking their way over rocky terrain that seemed designed to kill. Darby led from the front, as he always did. When the path became too narrow for the column to move safely, he went ahead personally to find a route. When men became exhausted, he encouraged them forward. He did not ask his soldiers to do anything he would not do himself. By 6 in the morning on March 21st, they had reached a plateau overlooking the Italian position from behind. Below them, the Italians were preparing breakfast, completely unaware that 500 American Rangers were watching from above. The mortarmen quietly set up their weapons and registered their targets. The Rangers checked their rifles and fixed bayonets. As the sun rose, the Rangers attacked from the rear, while the 26th Infantry Regiment struck from the front. The Italians never had a chance. Caught between two forces, and unable to reposition their defences, they collapsed in minutes. The Rangers swept through the Italian positions with bayonets and grenades, overwhelming resistance before it could organise. By noon, the fighting was over. The Rangers captured 200 prisoners and opened the pass for the American advance. By late afternoon, some 1,400 Axis prisoners had been rounded up and marched down from the hills. The Rangers had suffered only 6 men wounded, none killed. General Allen issued a letter of commendation that resulted in a Presidential Unit citation for the 1st Ranger Battalion. It was the first such award given to an American unit in the European theatre of the Second World War. The Italians had already given the Rangers a different kind of recognition. After a brutal night raid at Send Station 5 weeks earlier, they had started calling them the Black Death. Throughout March and April, the Americans continued to learn and improve. They integrated air support with ground operations, developing procedures for calling in airstrikes that would serve them throughout the war. They coordinated artillery fire more effectively, massing guns on targets instead of distributing them across the front. They positioned units to provide mutual support instead of scattering them across the landscape. The 34th Infantry Division, which had performed poorly at Kasserine, redeemed itself in the final weeks of the campaign. At a critical pass on the road to Tunis, the division proved it had overcome its early failures by taking ground that more experienced units had been unable to capture. The same soldiers who had run in February stood and fought in April. The Germans noticed the change. Their intelligence reports from late March and early April noted that American units were maneuvering more aggressively and recovering from setbacks more quickly. Tactics that had worked at Kasserine were failing against the same opponents. The easy victories the Germans had expected never materialized. Even Rommel had recognized what was happening before he left Tunisia. Unlike Hitler and many German generals, Rommel did not make the mistake of permanently underestimating the Americans after Kasserine. He had noted in his papers that they had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had succeeded in blocking German advances by grouping their reserves to defend critical points. German intelligence reports from late March confirmed his assessment. The Americans were learning fast. By early May, the end was near for Axis forces in Tunisia. Allied armies closed in from east and west. German and Italian units found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket around Tunis and Bizerte. Supply ships from Italy were being sunk before they reached North Africa. The Axis forces were running out of ammunition, fuel, and food. On May 7, 1943, British forces captured Tunis, while Americans took Bizerte, the last port in Axis hands. The Axis position collapsed completely. German soldiers surrendered in such numbers that they clogged the roads, actually preventing further Allied advances. Commanders who had fought on for months gave up without resistance. 6 days later, on May 13th, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered unconditionally. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners of war, including most of the legendary Afrika Korps. It was a larger surrender than Stalingrad, a catastrophe for the Axis that would have implications far beyond North Africa. The best of Germany's desert warriors were gone forever. The American army that helped win that victory was almost unrecognizable from the force that had fled Kasserine Pass 3 months earlier. In 90 days, they had transformed from beaten amateurs into battle-hardened professionals who could stand against any army in the world. The lessons they learned in Tunisia, written in blood and paid for in suffering, would serve them for the rest of the war. They had learned that leadership mattered, that officers who led from the front inspired men to fight, while officers who hid in bunkers inspired men to run. They had learned that coordination mattered, that units working together could defeat forces that would destroy them if they fought alone. They had learned that training mattered, that soldiers who practiced until their responses became automatic could function in the chaos of battle. Most importantly, they had learned that they could win. The lessons of Tunisia would serve them well in the years ahead. They would invade Sicily, then Italy, then France. They would fight through the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. They would cross the Rhine and drive into the heart of Germany. None of it would have been possible without the hard lessons of North Africa. George Patton never forgot what his men accomplished at El Guettar. He called it the first armoured victory of American forces in the European War. One participant later recalled that El Guettar had proven the U.S. Army's first major triumph against the German army in World War II. Later, in France and Germany, Patton would lead armoured offensives that shattered German defences across hundreds of miles. He would become the most famous American general of the war, a legend in his own time. But El Guettar was where he proved that American soldiers could fight, and he never forgot the men who had made that victory possible. Patton left Tunisia in April 1943 to plan the invasion of Sicily. Command of the Second Corps passed to Omar Bradley, who would go on to lead the American ground forces in Normandy and across Europe. Both men had been transformed by their experience in North Africa. Both had learned lessons that would shape their leadership for the rest of the war. Terry Allen continued to lead the Big Red One through Sicily before being relieved of command in August 1943. The relief had nothing to do with his combat performance, which was outstanding. The First Infantry Division under Allen had fought in every major engagement in North Africa and had performed brilliantly in Sicily, but Bradley and other senior commanders felt that Allen's aggressive, independent style did not fit their vision of military professionalism. Allen had made enemies by going around the chain of command and by his open contempt for staff officers who had never heard a shot fired in anger. But Allen was not finished. He returned to the United States and took command of the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. He trained them with the same intensity and passion he had brought to the Big Red One. When the Timberwolves landed in France in 1944, they became one of the most effective divisions in the European theatre. Allen led them with distinction through the final campaigns in Germany, proving that his first relief had been a mistake. Decades later, veterans who served under him still spoke of his leadership with reverence. They remembered a general who led from the front, shared their dangers, and cared more about winning battles than impressing superiors. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. went on to become one of the most beloved leaders in the American Army. Despite his age and physical limitations, he insisted on leading from the front. On June 6, 1944, he landed with the first wave at Utah Beach, the oldest man and the only general in the initial assault. When the landing craft dropped their ramps in the wrong location, Roosevelt walked the beach under German fire, calmly directing troops to their objectives. His leadership helped establish the beachhead and saved countless lives. He died of a heart attack on July 12, 1944, less than 6 weeks after the invasion. The stress of combat had finally overwhelmed his weakened heart. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on D-Day. His father, President Theodore Roosevelt, had also received the Medal of Honor, making them the only father and son so honored in American history. The general who had walked with a cane at El Guettar had walked under fire at Utah Beach, and his courage had helped change the course of the war. The 601 Tank Destroyer Battalion fought on through Italy, France, and Germany. They were credited with destroying over 100 enemy tanks by war's end, one of the highest totals of any American tank destroyer unit. Their stand at El Guettar remains one of the finest defensive actions in American military history. At El Guettar alone, the battalion was credited with destroying 37 tanks and 52 armoured vehicles total, more than making up for the 21 half-tracks they lost. The men of the 601 never forgot that morning in Tunisia, when they proved that American soldiers could stand and fight. Sergeant John Nowak survived the war and returned to Massachusetts. Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Baker received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership at El Guettar. The battalion itself received a Presidential Unit citation, joining Darby's Rangers as one of the first American units so honored in the European theater. Decades after the war, veterans of the 601 still gathered to remember their fallen comrades and the battle that had transformed them from untested soldiers into combat veterans. One participant later said that probably the greatest training benefit of the Battle of El Guettar was learning that the opponent was not 10 feet tall. That lesson, learned in blood on a Tunisian hillside, would sustain American soldiers through 3 more years of war. And the German commanders who had mocked American fighting ability at Kasserine, most of them became prisoners of war in Tunisia. Von Arnim was captured on May 12, 1943, one of 12 German generals taken in the final days of the campaign. The general who had sent the 10th Panzer Division to destroy the Americans at El Guettar found himself marching into a prisoner of war camp, defeated by the army he had dismissed as incapable of fighting. The prisoners captured in Tunisia were shipped across the Atlantic to camps in the United States. They would spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire, watching from afar as the country they had underestimated liberated Europe. Many of them never returned to Germany. The war they had expected to win ended with their nation in ruins. Rommel was not among the prisoners. He had left North Africa in March, sick and exhausted, suffering from liver problems and depression. The desert fox, who had terrorized British forces for 2 years, would never return to the desert where he had made his reputation. But he had seen enough to know that the American army he had defeated at Kasserine was not the American army he would face if the Allies invaded Europe. He was right. When Rommel took command of German defences in France in late 1943, he found himself facing an enemy that had learned from its mistakes, adapted to modern warfare, and developed into one of the most effective fighting forces on Earth. The Americans who landed in Normandy were not the Americans who had fled at Kasserine Pass. They were the successors of the men who had stood at El Guettar, and they carried that legacy with them onto the beaches of France. The change that began in the desert hills of Tunisia would shape the outcome of the entire war. When American soldiers landed in Normandy in June 1944, they carried with them everything they had learned at Kasserine Pass and El Guettar. They knew how to coordinate infantry, armour, and artillery. They knew how to mass firepower on critical points. They knew how to recover from setbacks and keep fighting. Most importantly, they knew they could beat the Germans. The Wehrmacht that faced them was still a formidable enemy. German soldiers were brave, well-trained, and expertly led. Their equipment was often superior to American weapons, but the German army had lost something in Tunisia that it would never recover. It had lost the belief that it could always defeat the Americans. At Kasserine, they had won. At El Guettar, they had lost. And as the war continued, they would keep losing. That is how armies learn to fight. Not through easy victories, but through disaster, humiliation, and the determination to never let it happen again. The American soldiers who ran at Kasserine became the American soldiers who stood at El Guettar. The officers who failed in February became the leaders who triumphed in May. The army that was mocked by friends and enemies alike became the army that liberated Europe. Rommel had been right about one thing at Kasserine. The Americans were green and poorly led. But he made the same mistake that many enemies of the United States have made throughout history. He underestimated their ability to learn, adapt, and overcome. He saw their weakness, but missed their potential. He won the first battle, but misjudged the war. 30 days after Kasserine Pass, the same American soldiers he had routed proved him completely wrong, and they would keep proving him wrong for the next 2 years, all the way to the heart of Nazi Germany. The army that had run from German tanks in February 1943 would be accepting Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. The transformation that made that victory possible began in the dusty hills of Tunisia, where men who had known nothing but defeat learned how to win. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.